do my best. So she wrote a very nice report, which is a PDF which I can provide you with. So her investigation involved basically interviews with the technical directors of house builders during the winter of 2021. And there were sort of 4 themes that she was focusing on, which will be the order in which I discuss the results. So starting off with the decision-making process for hydrological compliance, moving on to talk about what was the added value that putting SUDs or nature-based solutions brought, well, specifically nature-based SUDs into sites. Thirdly, the technical cost and planning constraints that inhibit the routine use of SUDs in new developments. And finally, what needs to change. So she recruited the technical, she wrote to 9 house builders, technical directors, largely large volume builders serving the Yorkshire and Humber region. She had 4 positive responses, which my colleagues from Syria tell me is, they're very excited that she's heard something from house builders, because it's always quite a hard area to find out about. So there were 4 interviews lasting 60 to 90 minutes. The interviews were audio recorded and transcribed. Identifying information was then removed. So coming to then what was found. So all the different house builders reported something of a similar decision-making process with some small differences. And I've kind of blocked what she put as a 7-step process into a 3-step process here, just trying to make sense of it for visual needs. I think what strikes me about it is that within the house builders organisation, there are different teams, and the different teams have charge of the material at different times. So the technical team gets sent a map of a potential site, and they make a feasibility plan for it. And they then also generate a constraints plan highlighting the drainage. But then they send it to the designers, and the designers then make a sort of roughly a design of, okay, given that rough idea about drainage, how are we going to set out the houses? And once they've done that, the technical team come back and develop a detailed drainage plan. Then it goes to the land team, who work out what the costs and benefits would be. They select a price they're willing to offer, and they make an offer for the site. So all of that first and second stage happens before the site is purchased. If, as a consequence of that offer, the site is purchased, the land team then work with the planning team to request permission. So for me, that's a bit of an eye-opener as to how the process works. So some particular factors that she said sort of really shaped that process was particularly, the local authority, their plan requirements are primary influence, and all of the technical directors said it's best to speak to the planners to understand what they want. But they also highlighted the challenges of working in the competitive dynamics of the land market, and how house builders have to balance the commercial pressure to acquire land with the regulatory requirements of flood alleviation. And in particular, how landowners' expectations about, of course you could fit 100 houses onto that plot. It's got to be worth more than that. The landowners are trying to drive their price down, and so there's a real balancing act they have to do. The land management companies, as in the people who are going to sort of look after the site after they've sold it for the owners of properties, they have very limited influence on design. But they do over some of the details. So, for example, land management companies have particular desires about how deep the pond is and what the slopes are and things like that. Another common factor that all of the developers said was that they favoured off-plot SUDs, as in SUDs which were on the shared land of a development, not on individual housing plots. So they said that SUDs away from the domestic property are preferred because they can be relied to contribute to volumetric calculations. And somebody talked about an anecdote of one of their competitors who'd put permeable paving on the plots and then found that didn't count towards what the water company measured. They avoid awkward customs questions from potential buyers about, well, what am I meant to do with that? And you say, I've got a responsibility to look after that. Well, I want to change my garden to, I don't know, put plastic glass in or something. So, and also it's much more simple to design. It doesn't need sort of careful management of the site and every plot being different. So that was kind of their logic on that. Moving on then to the second area, do nature-based solutions add any value? The interviewees were in agreement that SUDs and nature-based solutions did not add value to the sales price of properties from their point of view. However, some house builders, not all of them, acknowledged that that SUDs, and in particular, as part of good landscaping, could have a positive impact on the marketability of a site. And there was also some hint that, as biodiversity net gain and concerns about greening become more prominent, that might become more important in the future. So I think there's some potential opportunities from our point of view there. In terms of moving on to the third area, constraints inhibiting use, obviously soil composition and topography are important in thinking about the drainage. Somebody highlighted that in the Hull area, the soil can vary a lot locally within a site. So although they said, we think, oh, this is a chalk area, fantastic, we can infiltrate. And then they found that bits of it you couldn't because, it was very variable. So I suppose that means they need more pre-investigation or something. They claimed that they had complete access to all the technical skills they needed for SUDS design, that wasn't a problem, although they did flag up that if biodiversity net gain and greening becomes more important, they may need more skills in that regard in the future. Moving on then to the regulatory and adoption constraints, I suppose this sort of interview is inevitably going to bring out people moaning about the people they're trying to work with and the challenges they have. So some people highlighted conflict within the local authority between the planners and the flood risk managers, and also that they talked about delays and inconsistent requests from the planners that caused delays for them, and some lack of competence. Particularly, they said that the planning profession, something that maybe I need to take on, planning profession lack understanding of SUDs and don't understand that permeable paving won't work on clay or other things, or suggesting a pond at the top of the hill. They also highlighted some challenges they had in terms of water companies. They said the water companies have very exacting requirements that tend to push them towards concrete boxes. So there was a distinction made between the incumbent water companies, who can be stringent and exacting in their requests, for example, regarding the sizing of ponds, whereas private water companies, they said, tend to be more flexible. What I haven't completely worked out is what Sarah meant by private and incumbent water companies, but maybe somebody else in the room will know. Nature was also excluded from some of these because of in the requirements in terms of maintenance. There was, for example, often a requirement that grass was cut very low, and they said, well, that doesn't really fit with supporting biodiversity. So they felt there was a conflict in the government priorities, or in the way the priorities were implemented between different parties. They also highlighted a number of constraints related to land markets and maintenance. So I've already hinted at the thing that landowners don't usually understand SUDs and their requirements. As water quality comes on stream, there'll be an increase in the land required, they suggested, which will make SUDs an even more expensive intervention from their point of view than there is now. While they said, it's easy to do maintenance with a management company, they said that doesn't apply. There's always a difficult patch between when they finish creating the SUDs, which often they have to do early, and the handover to the management company, which will only come when they finish the site. And there's a patch when they have to find a way to do the maintenance, which isn't normally their job, and to keep the litter off and so on. So they said that's an awkward transition period. There's a feeling that because of local authorities being so strapped for cash, they were less and less willing to adopt SUDs. Hopefully, if Schedule 3 comes in, that'll change. And there were changes and they also highlighted an issue about joint maintenance, when you've got a management company doing some part, but you've got a local authority or water company who've adopted an asset doing another part. But they said the local authority and water company don't tend to maintain to such high quality, they don't maintain the aesthetic standards, and can mean the site doesn't look as good, which they didn't feel was good for their reputation. So concluding then with what needs to change, they said, well, we need a level playing field with clear, consistent and easy to apply rules. And if they're wanted, that needs to incorporate on-plot SUDs. They suggested that housing allocation needs to come with a blue-green infrastructure plan that should specify the percentage of the site to be allocated to both SUDs and biodiversity gain. And if that allocation happened at the point the site is allocated for housing, then landowners would understand. I think that was their key point, that this is a way that landowners could understand the restriction on the value that can be gained from their site. And then there was a recognition that as water quality requirements come more on stream, they'll have to upskill, and they're concerned that there might be conflict with purchasers who want tidy sites without lots of messy plants. So a bit of a whiz through that material, but thank you for listening. So what we'll do is we'll move directly on to the next presentation, which is Christine, and then we'll come back for questions once we've done 3.
Christine, do you want me to show you slides?
Yes, please. I was just about to say,
wish me luck, I'm going in.
Never sure how to do this. I've got too many slides, Tim, I think, so I'm going to speak very quickly.
Oops. Can you see my screen now?
We can see, yes, we can see your screen, but what we can see is it's coming up.
Yeah, is it coming up?
And you need to make it slideshow.
Yeah, doing it now.
Brilliant.
You will need to tell me when to move on.
I will do that. Okay, we can move on, I think, because it's summary of, this is right. So just this is summary of engagement. Right. So I've nicked some of the slides from a very good presentation Liz gave the other morning to China. And this is one of them. So I think it's just like, this was what the community engagement was attempting, what this is what Magic was attempting to do. And so the idea was that through community engagement, we would not only engage people of Hull with community rain management, but we'd also engage authorities, the partners that we're working with methods of community engagement. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, regardless of which method, we'll get to the specifics later, but these are the principles for community engagement that Magic employed, which was essentially to develop relationships, focus on positive gains, not negative avoidance, and build legacy. So developing relationships is like good communications. It kind of goes without saying in some respects, but actually it doesn't. Is really honest and open, trust-making communication, inclusive. So you deal with all the community rather than just the section that wants to talk to you. Two-way communication, and you're responsive. If you're told things, you actually act on it. It isn't just a kind of, we're going to consult and then do what we're going to consult people with what we're going to do. We actually change what we do, which is why we're doing action research, which we're responsive and flexible to the needs or the aspirations of the communities we're working with. Positive gains, not negative avoidance, is rather than going in with what the problem is, you go in with what would be the benefits. And that means that you're going with what people, the community, think are the benefits, as opposed to what you think are the benefits. Obviously, it's a benefit to avoid floods, but it's not as you're avoiding a negative. You're not actually gaining the positive of biodiversity or green spaces to meet in. And building legacy right from the beginning, having an eye on the legacy, because you're going to be, as we said, we were going in for a short time and we wanted to leave things better than when we came in. And so partly, you know, I'll get on to the celebrations, but actually framing things as a celebration, and also finding ways that you're going to be able to pass on the baton in a kind of useful way. Next slide, please. Okay, so our basic methods, fundamental methods that we employed was community profiling, which is just to kind of really try and find out specifics of the areas that you're working in. Locate, identify key individuals. It's those people who have really got in the time frame that you've got going into communities. You can't hope to do proper kind of real depth engagement with everybody. So you engage with the people who've already done that work. You engage with the people who are kind of embedded within that community, who've already got the ear and the trust of that community. Presence is trying to spend, now this was hard for us because of all sorts of reasons, but presence is spending time with that community, actually attend the events, be for the time that you're there, try and be there with people. And events and activities. So under the guidance of key individuals, it's like do engagement stuff that has relevance to the community. Next slide, please. So the engagement, the evolution of the methods or the plan that we had for Magic changed quite rapidly and significantly. Where we started, the idea was that we would very quickly co-design installations into geographic areas, geographic communities, and then concentrate on using those installations to engage the wider community, because you'd have a demonstration there. That was the idea. And then in spring, we had the pandemic, which kind of flipped everything up in the air. We tried remote engagement through Magic Boxes, and actually that's just kind of, it says, validates the understanding that you need to build relationships. It's very difficult to build relationships on social media if you haven't already got some sort of presence or some sort of relationship with people. So during the winter of 2020, 2021, I concentrated on engaging the engagers, so the people in Hull who were doing the engagement work, who had an understanding of what was going on across the city. In spring, we developed a new kind of community engagement plan, which looked at, but you know, by this time we are running, not it's like running out, but our time has been truncated. So rather than enabling communities to decide where they thought the installations could go and doing a full negotiation with that, we looked to save time. But actually what's happened is serendipitously we've created a kind of new way of working, which I think has real advantages. And that was we looked for buildings that had, first in the 2 areas, and then we expanded that, buildings that had footfall, that had construction permission. So I know Rachel was there and things, but getting permission on council buildings takes a long time, longer than we had. So it had to be people who had some sort of autonomy. You know, we had contact with the managers of that building who had the autonomy to decide and give permission for installations to be granted, you know. And then by the summer of 2021, we were engaging with 5 communities of building users. So the people who use the buildings that we'd chosen, or that we, you know, they'd chosen us in some respects. Next slide, please. So the advantages I was saying about of this is that you have you have specific identifiable key individuals. You don't have to spend time looking for them. They're the people who are managing that building. You have a more discrete community with existing channels of contact. So, you know, the Cottingham Civic Hall had a database of their users and volunteers. So it's a kind of like a more doable, engagement process. It's more in line, I feel, with the way that water management practitioners have to work, is that they are unlikely to be able to decide with a community where the SUDs should go, the chances are they're going to have a designated space, and they have to go in and then engage that community with what has kind of already been decided to some extent. So having a discrete space within a community that you have to work, it kind of mirrors more. So in a sense, I feel the research became more useful for water managing practitioners and authorities. It provided a very clear demonstration of the need to tailor engagement to each community, because we were working with very different buildings and therefore very different communities of building users. And I think the diversity then was that it went beyond the geographical area, because we were working, you know, with a church, with a retail business, community centre, civic hall and primary school. They have very different communities of users from the get-go, regardless of the geographic area. Can I next slide, please? Oh, this was a lovely, beautifully neat that Liz developed on this slide. So this just gives you, this is a reminder of the different buildings, the adaptations on each of those buildings, and a kind of a very, very quick summary of the engagement process that happened. Which was, as I say, very different for each building. So for example, with the primary school and Seawell's garage, that your key individual was going to be the person who made the decision. So the co-design had to happen with them. They were the ultimate decision makers. And then the process was to engage with, in a sense, what we co-designed then with Seawell's garage and with Bilton Primary School was the way in which we then engaged the wider the community of building users. However, in the church, Orchard Park and the Civic Hall, we began with engaging a group, the community groups who were the main users of the building, with the design. Can we go to the next slide? So rather than go through each of them, I'm just going to give two contrasting sites. So in Bilton Primary School, we met with the head, and she was very keen on an outdoor classroom. So rather than having tanks on the school, on the building, she wanted an outdoor classroom, which has the potential to become a future SUDS, and certainly is a means by which it opens a discussion for rain management, which was our priority. There are a number. I mean, what you're seeing here is that we brought a community theatre into the school as part of that engagement process. So once the outdoor classroom was done, and that was done during the holidays, it wasn't done in consultation with any of the kids or with any of the families. It was a fait accompli. It was then a question of how do we engage then the children and their families with what has happened and what significance this has in terms of rain management. One of those ways was having a community theatre company come in and work over a period of 5 days during their science week within the school on rain management, on a rain management play which involved rain gods and all sorts of things, and it's all very gorgeous. Next slide, please. So what we did with Bilton, because actually this head was adamant that she didn't want any talk of flooding. I mean, when the first interview we had with her was, I'm not having floods. My kids have just gone through a pandemic. We don't need any more disasters, or kind of like, you know, the idea of potential disasters. So what we did was we developed things. First of all, it was actually noticing rain, getting actually as an element, as an important element, as something that you could value. And then managing about how you could maybe manage small amounts of rain. So managing rain for play, managing rain in your garden, noticing big rain, what big rain means. That what I mean by that is, you know, big rain events and what that might mean to an area. And then, you know, you can say rain management as part of flood resilience. You start then having already got to an understanding of and an engagement with rain and rain management, you get into then flood resilience, and then you can actually start talking about community flood resilience on a bigger scale. Now, we So we started with family activity booklets, which we worked on with the school. They got sent out to families at strategic points on a lead up to what ultimately was the Festival of Rain, which invited the families in to look at the outdoor classroom and to engage with different activities that really kind of looked at all 1 to 5 steps. As I've already said, the children devised a theatre piece, which then was performed at that Festival of Rain. And I think part of, I kind of accept it's in italics because it hasn't happened yet, but Living with Water, Eve from Living with Water was very keen to get into that school and to kind of like engage with schools in general. And Sarah is now looking at taking, where they've already arranged that the children are going to be taken to one of the Living with Water workshops, and that Living with Water are going to be able to come in and do an assembly with the children. Now, Sarah says quite categorically that would not have happened had we not done the engagement process that we did prior to that. So I think that's kind of a success. So next slide, please. So as I say, we in other sites, as in with Orchard Park and the Thorpe Centre, we've done engagement throughout. Not as much as I would like, but we have done more than in other sites. And that's because they were quite a challenging site with quite a challenged community. The engagement activities, we did engagement activities with community groups. So like with the food bank, have a kind of coffee morning prior to queuing, and we went along and spoke to them. We went and looked at worked with Mike's Youth Centre and with the family groups. We did interviews with local residents, and the planting day was very great success. We had 2 family groups invited and local residents invited to a planting day where we planted trees and in the area around the centre, and we ran out of plants really quickly. We thought we would have to encourage them to do this, but actually they were so keen on it, we'd run out of plants by halfway through and didn't hardly have any for the next group, which was a little bit sad. But anyway, community engagement mural. Emma, who's the muralist, who did she's got a lot of experience and she worked with young people, and that meant that there was actual kind of, the kids have actually had hands-on on the transformation of the centre. I mean, to stress that what we're doing here, so what the residents came up with was limited interest in the rain management side of it. Yes, okay. They were really interested in improving the look of their centre. Oh, sorry, I'm pressing it to go. Can you go to the next slide? Go. Right, so dealing with challenges, I was saying that it was a challenging space. We had some vandalism to some of the installations. The centre wanted a green roof, which we really tried hard to find a way of doing, but we just couldn't, for financial and for logistical reasons. And the trees died during the drought. So overcoming that, because we had a presence, because we had trust with the key individuals, so the community development officer managed the narrative, because an area that's very quick to get into a negative narrative. She went into social media and kind of like nipped that in the bud before it got started. The damage was promptly repaired, and it wasn't that much, but it made the difference, and it was quickly repaired. So again, that negative story got flipped around. We had multiple meetings and updates with key individuals, reducing the disappointment. Well, just keeping them up to date on how things were progressing with the green roof, or not, as the case turned out. And we've got a replanting activity day planned for later this month, which will address the problem with the drought, which we didn't plan, but kind of like emphasizes climate change. Next slide, please. All bar Thorpe. So the replanting day will be the celebration in Thorpe's, but all the other 4 sites, what we've done is a big celebration day to kind of conclude the installation creation. And this is one of them. Next slide. In terms of legacy, we've got signage going to each of those sites. And there are, I mean, I'm conducting interviews with the key individuals now because we're concluding the project. And there's been some really good outcomes that I can't list now because I haven't concluded all the interviews, but there's some great stuff coming up. Okay, that's me. Thank you, I think. Sorry for going over time. Did say there was 2 minutes.
Thank you, Christine. Our third presentation is about communication. Kira.
Hi, everybody. Compared to those 2 amazing presentations, this is going to be a very much smaller and more minor insight. I've only been employed on this project since April, 2 days a week. So I'm very much the junior. I'm very much still on the steep learning curve. So this is really, it's barely more than a question that I've sort of begun to think about. So I'm interested in the fact that communication tends to rank quite low on hierarchies of engagement. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this. This is Einstein's famous ladder. And if you look at the bottom rungs, they're manipulation and therapy. So Einstein classifies these as types of non-participation. She says that they exist to help power holders to educate or cure the public. And interestingly, she describes manipulation as a public relations exercise. And I think there's a really interesting way in which the development of her way of thinking about this fits into a wider historical shift in terms of the growth of a suspicion about communications, public relations, and advertising as a form of manipulation or brainwashing in the wake of the Second World War. So if we look further up the ladder, we have another 3 rungs: informing, consultation, and placation. And for Einstein, these are levels of tokenistic participation. So they're where citizens are heard, but not necessarily heeded. And her problem with informing is that it's often one way. There's no channel for feedback and there's no power for negotiation. So it doesn't lead to meaningful change. Now, Einstein, of course, she's writing in the field of urban planning. So her model of engagement tends to draw on an idea of collective decision-making. So justice requires not just dialogue, but proper power sharing with communities. But thinking about my own past experience, what about occasions where engagement doesn't follow such a collective model? What about occasions where it involves lots of people making private and individual decisions? Now, those decisions may refer outwards to collective goods and evils, but they're still taken individually. So ideas of power sharing and collective forms of dialogue may be slightly less relevant here. So to give an example, I used to be the director of comms for the NHS cancer screening programs. And believe it or not, cancer screening is actually one of the most controversial areas of modern medicine. And that's because it does preventative medicine and follows a utilitarian logic. So all screening programs do an amount of harm to a small minority of people so that they can do a greater good to a greater number in catching disease early. And the nature and degree of that harm varies from program to program. So take cervical cancer screening, a number of women will go for a test and they'll get a false positive and they'll have to be referred for further checks. And that can cause anxiety, which we can all agree is a harm. But with breast cancer screening, you're using X-rays to detect cancers. And when you screen a large population of women with X-rays, you will actually cause a small number of cancers. At the same time, those X-rays will catch a greater number of cases of this devastating disease at an early stage. So on one side of the balance, you have a very serious harm to a small number of women. And then the other, you have the good of a great number of early detections at a more curable stage. And most people, I think, would agree that the harm in this case of breast cancer screening causing cancer is more severe than the harm of anxiety in cervical screening. So my job was to find ways of communicating these differences in the risks and benefits to women. It wasn't to tell them that they should go to screening. It was to give them the information they needed to make a choice for themselves. But the information that I had to convey at the same time had this collective element to it. These were giant sets of complex population-based stats that are used to quantify the benefits and harms for the NHS. So I had to write a leaflet to facilitate an individual choice, but thinking about this wider public. And it's not entirely a private atomized choice because no choice ever really is. Now, I doubt that our screening leaflets would rate any higher really than informing on Einstein's ladder. Yet we've got a situation here where giving women accurate, reliable, robust information is a kind of empowerment and arguably a kind of power sharing, because it's a long way, after all, from the traditional and paternalist mode of medicine where women were simply told what to do by their healthcare provider. And thinking about some of our leaflets for this project too, where we're encouraging people to think about getting a water butt, are they that different in the balance? Like the screening leaflets, these are designed to help individuals or families to get the information they need to make a personal decision about whether they put a water butt on their domestic home. And like the screening leaflets, they're based on a balance between some collective arguments, like you can help to prevent pollution and flooding, and some individual benefits, like you'll get a personal source of water for your garden or for the car. But unlike the screening leaflets, there aren't any very significant risks or harms. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, installing a water butt isn't a very big sacrifice or a very dangerous thing to do, even if you're as bad at DIY as I am. So is it legitimate to maybe stress benefits and use information where an activity involves low risk and potentially strong upsides? Is informing people about those benefits necessarily an evil or coercive thing to do? Perhaps there are some situations where the higher rungs of Einstein's ladder don't come into play. Of course, if a water butt's in the shared public space and the kind of engagement that Christina's just been talking about, then that top of the ladder is absolutely relevant. It comes straight back into play. But in a domestic installation, maybe the balance is slightly different. So it's easy to write off comms as a sort of dark art, as manipulative or as vacuous. But professional expertise around things like tone, voice, and visual language can be really useful to build into a project from the start, where you do have a situation where people are making individual and private decisions. And creating informational comm stores is a specialism in its own right, and its logic and ethics may be slightly different from those of wider engagement. So maybe there's something to be gained by undoing the binary between bad comms and good engagement and recognizing differences of situations. So I guess my plea is to think about the place of information. Perhaps it isn't always the most disempowering low rung of the ladder that it is in Einstein.
Thank you, Kira. Okay, so now we have a sort of chance for questions, discussion. You want to stop presenting. Questions, discussion, thoughts, ideas. I mean, perhaps as a start, I wonder if there's any sort of points of clarification people have. Rachel.
Yeah, the developer one really interested me, the first presentation, and especially the decision process that the developers, house builders said they went through, which is the exact opposite to what we find in all. I could name on a hand the number of I wish they'd do it in that way. I really do wish they'd look at a piece of land and then look at what their drainage design would be, and then look at how many houses they could fit on, and then negotiate the land price. But unfortunately, I do feel with Hull is that they just think we can build crap and people will buy crap, which is unfortunately what is happening. And so they just buy land, and they also feel they can. I think our planning committee has quite a lot to blame in terms of the politics and some of their priorities potentially. So that's where politics comes in, and it's about cramming more houses on a site than it is about actually thinking about the quality of those houses and the issues that we may get in the long run. So it's frustrating because that process that they outlined is really what we want them to do. But I just don't have much experience of that really. I can think of one site that's happening on now, but most of them, they come to me and they're already saying, we've had a pre-app with your planning committee. They've told us we need to fit this many houses on. They've not mentioned SUDs. and we're now trying to retrofit a SUDS design into what we've already decided. So yeah, it's quite interesting.
Thanks, Rachel. I mean, obviously, I guess this is a set of keen developers who were willing to have a conversation. So they may not be typical. And also, of course, they're going to present their positive side in an interview. So that's just really interesting. And I think, Louise, who's not able to be here today, suggested that me and her and Sue Illman need to work together on a sort of counterbalance to this report. So when we publish it, we'll probably publish the report, and we'll publish a summary, and we'll publish a sort of alternative view or challenges or questions raised, some sort of response to it. Sebastian.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentations. First, a clarifying question or something exciting. The first presentation at the end, someone talked about, I think, the recommendation percentage of a site to be destined for biodiversity or SUDS. I was wondering, is that something you recommend, or is that already happening in your country? Because that would make a very big difference. So just first clarifying, otherwise I want to elaborate.
Yeah, it's a recommendation. At the moment, the only rules require a requirement about the volumetric control, nothing to do with anything else. But I think the thing which I told you about at the beginning of this meeting, where the government are about to change their rules might bring in, I don't know exactly what their rules change will do, but it's likely to require something more substantial than they do now.
Yeah, I have to say, in the Netherlands, they've done this, and it's a game changer. So you work with the city of Dordrecht, they said, okay, 40% of the land should be green. And then all of a sudden everything changed, because they have to start looking for space, be it on plots or on every scale, they're looking for space. And they completely changed the paradigm when developing, but also in existing spaces. So that's a very interesting one. Of course, it's beyond your control, but
yeah, no, really interesting. And I'm conscious, like Kira's working on an application at the moment about biodiversity net gain. So it's all it's like a nice crossover between the SUDS and the biodiversity net gain side.
On that said, maybe on biodiversity, we're working on we have a new European program which was approved, so we at least have now 10 million euros to do some research on it, similarly like 9 million pounds. But it's also on biodiversity. We also need a bit of what the baseline is. It's much harder to understand. We don't even know how good it is. So we say we're going to work on biodiversity the same way we started with SUDS. And we said, okay, actually we do flood control, but we found out that health benefits are the biggest, or maybe biodiversity. Now we're working focused on biodiversity, the same greening thing, making blue and green. But then where do we start? How biodiversity is it now? And so that comes with all sorts of new research questions. And it's interesting if you're working on SUDS to make these links, because I find there's much more political attention and funding available, and that's for good reason. That's our democratic elected politicians think there's interest, and there's also more upside.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that was highlighted in Christine's presentation, wasn't it, where she was saying we need to sell the upside, not the prevented downside.
Yeah, another anecdote. So I don't want to talk too much, but we had another example there when we did. I mean, the last 10 years, let's say 10 years, 5 years ago, we said climate adaptation. We did workshops, and we had maybe 20 people coming, and those were basically the usual suspects. So the typical citizens that sign up for any workshop. They're either bored or they care a lot or whatever. So, but the same, typically elderly women. Sorry to simplify things. They're like, okay, it's a nice kind of to go to have a coffee and talk to the other same neighbors, but not the diversity of the neighborhood. And the moment we said, let's do a workshop about how we make your neighborhood livable and green, all of a sudden we had 60 people coming, completely different people. So that changed a lot. And it goes a bit with this positive, it's also more positive, the upside or whatever you want to call it. But also trying to change the topic. Eventually we're talking about the same thing, we just frame it differently. So I recognized what you presented.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Kate.
Hi, yeah, I've got a question and I guess a bit of a reflection, a question for Christine and a reflection for Kira, I guess. So, yeah, I'm sort of really impressed with how the project was able to kind of deal with the whole pandemic thing, and it's all about community engagement, but the reality was, that's about building relationships, as you said, but it's so hard when you're not able to do any of that. So I guess I'm just sort of interested, partly because the program's in this sort of evaluation phase now, sort of thinking about what, what has had value from the whole program. So we're, thinking about these questions. But given that you're trying to sort of achieve legacy, have these honest conversations, be inclusive, have these positive focuses and sort of build legacy, given what actually happened and the focusing on these community buildings and, that had footfall, if you were doing something like this again, would you do it differently? How has it affected your sort of approach to this, to doing community engagements on things like this?
I would go and live in the place where I'm doing the community engagement for the duration of the time. I mean, just because it was so hard doing it at distance. And when I say presence, it's like, yeah, we tried, and we ended up doing more of that in Orchard Park than we did in the other sites, because we knew there were more challenges there, and it did indeed present very immediate challenges. But we were still going in, and we were working with very busy youth workers who were already, they were already stretched because they were dealing with during the pandemic and then the aftermath of, with people with much more primary needs, like needing nutrition for the kids during the summer holidays than water tanks. The thing that meant that we didn't have as much presence. I didn't have as much presence in the other sites. And in fact, that's come up with the Cottingham Civic Hall interview, where because they were and it was a middle class area, they were kind of relatively well off, they understood what was going on, kind of like thought the things were just bubbling on okay. Actually, there are some things that have happened there that I wasn't aware of, that I'm now going to have to deal very quickly with before we finish the project. So I would be more present, would be one of the things. I mean, we would do it differently. I wouldn't do it during a pandemic. So we'd get the installations done in the first, kind of at the front end of things. And then you would have something concrete to then talk about what in communication needs to be accompany that installation in order to maximize the usefulness of it in terms of it engaging people. I'd also front load the signage, and that has actually come up from one of the that we should have been looking at signage at the same time as we were looking at which installations, and starting then, because it's taken a lot longer to get the signage sorted out, and I don't feel we've done enough of the engagement. We've not been able to ask people what kind of communication would you like with any real depth to that, because we just simply have run out of time.
So I think I would do less. I would do less buildings. I would have probably, I should really have done it anyway. I should have stopped Christine. Christine was like, oh, we can't do such high quality engagement asking people where we're going, so we need to do more. And at that point, I should have said, no, it's fine to just do 2. You choose which 2. Fine to just do 2. Let's not do 5. Because I think we might then have got a bit more written. I mean, it's not saying we haven't done marvelous things, and I do think we have learnt from the diversity, but we have been stretched thin. And
she's not wrong. She's not got very enthusiastic when people became enthusiastic about us doing things on buildings.
Megan.
Oh yeah, just thinking about the sustainability stuff, and I think this relates to some things we're thinking about in Tower Hamlets around public health, but I think there's something going on here. Like, we all know that as academic projects we kind of drop in, and we're all very self-critical of that, like we're not idiot, we know that funding lasts a certain amount of time. But I guess something we've started to think about is in our academic projects going forward, and these tend to be projects which are kind of like have a real community development kind of thrust to them, in building it in the project, a sustainability plan, for example. So there's loads of stuff around community researcher training, making sure that either that we train other community organisations as a network in a particular area to then educate each other as they go on. So say, for example, you have Bilton Primary School is a good example, then you put something in there in the future that allows then Bilton Primary School to have some kind of interaction and materials with another organisation, so then they can kind of like share knowledge and it goes forward beyond the life of the project. And the other thing that does seem to have an impact on as well is that then enables those organisations who you might have given some kind of like training materials to then apply for money to do that work in the future. So there's that kind of stuff going on, and it's just, you know, and you never think about it at the start, but actually they need income. And what you can potentially think about doing them is giving them away through grants that they can get more income. We're not going to solve the problem of them having core funding, but what we can do is make those organisations move forward, kind of like grow the ideas that we've developed with them, but also get some money into their organisations.
Christine.
Just to reply to that, I think one of the hopeful things that's happened with oh no, don't keep it raised. One of the useful things that's happened with the Thorpe Centre is that they've applied for a bid. I did think about it, Megan, from the beginning. I wasn't sure how we could do it, but for one of the things, I wanted the film to be done so that those buildings can demonstrate that they have already committed to doing ecological stuff, as that will help them with future funding bids for themselves to get money. And in fact, that's what happened in Thorpe Centre. Now they can't have a green roof. They've applied for a funding bid that will provide them with a second story with solar panels and a heat exchange boiler. So, I mean, we're hoping that they're successful, but they've certainly cited the rain management installations, the kind of like the fact that they've worked with us on that project as being part, I think, is potentially going to help them. Yeah, and there are other examples of that. And I think the Civic Hall, although that's one of the things I'm going to have to go and address, is that I'll get in. I mean, they need new, you know, as you know, Rob told you, they need new boilers, and there was the potential for them to get an energy plan done by the Flood Innovation Centre. Unfortunately, they haven't come back to them in time for the Civic Hall to be able to use that. And it's kind of like, that's one of the problems I think with co-production, is that different institutions just have different rhythms, have different time frames of how they, you know, community groups work much more quickly, much more nimble, because they're smaller and they don't have the same kind of systems. Universities are glacial in comparison, and that sometimes is a difficult mismatch in terms of engagement.
Okay, so thanks, Kate, for your input. Sorry, I was going to say thanks, Kate Lonsdale, for your input. I can also see there's some input from Kate, the other Kate, that I've not read yet. Are there any further questions about any of these presentations? Can have another sort of 3 or 4 minutes on this if we need to.
I've just got a question for Kira. A statement and a question. I never thought of communications as being a dark art. And I think informing people is the problem. Is if you're just informing, if it's just information, I don't know. I think there's a difference between communication and information. And I also think that if you're actually saying to people, we really want you to do this, I think you should be clear that it's like basically, I am going to try and manipulate you and tell you what I think is really good. I think at least you've been honest and upfront about the fact that this is what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways around some of this is co-production of like comms materials with communities. Like, you know, we didn't have time really, did we, like in this project? And it's something that would have been really nice to kind of design in, would be like a process of really co-producing leaflets with communities that would then kind of work out, you know, what kinds of messaging are the most effective. And I think Christine's got a bid in to kind of do some more work on that. So fingers crossed that comes through and she can do that, because it'd be really interesting.
Steve.
Oh yeah, just quickly to kind of chip into this one. I think the I think going right back to where Kira started and saying this kind of feeds into a much wider kind of set of ideas about distrust. It's part of the pathologizing, the demonizing of expertise, isn't it? And yet, one of the things that fascinates me about all this kind of watery work is that it's one of those situations where you cannot do without expertise around subject modeling and biodiversity and all those kinds of things. Obviously, so the whole, I don't know, it seems so crude to kind of lump all that in one place, whereas actually providing people with information, and then it comes down to the details of how you actually engage with people. And that lovely phrase about experts being on tap rather than on top comes to mind. So it doesn't even need to be co-production. It just needs to be the provision of useful information in usable ways is one thing. And as I put in the chat, I think one of the problems here is the basic, almost like an ambiguity. What Arnstein was talking about was where there's a development plan and the information is simply, this is going to happen. And that's what she was that's what she was attacking. Whereas that's kind of spilled out into this general kind of attitude of anti-informing, which is just, from my perspective, and my head's a bit fuzzy this morning, I'm just going to say it's completely bonkers. I can't think of the academically appropriate way of putting that, but it's just crazy. So I think there's a lot of, as I also said in the chat, Liz and I published something called Pulling Down the Ladder a long time ago. And basically, although it's a fine piece of polemic and it's been really useful over the years, it's way too simplistic to be used as a tool for analysis or a guide to action, really. That's why I think Christine's work is so interesting. Obviously that's anyone doing proper engagement does it in a much more nuanced way. But I do think there's a real issue here, and I think it's one that we haven't really bottomed out in the project to some extent. Reading through even the last version of the guide, I think there's still a tension running through that between the need for expertise and the need for community engagement in a rather different kind of way. And I think that, I'm not sure that we've examined that within the project. So I think it's there, not in any kind of hostile way, but I just think it's there as a thing that perhaps we should have talked about much earlier in the project. What do we actually mean by this, and how are we going to reconcile the watery experts, the landscape experts, the planners with the engagement side of the project in a way which is perhaps more open. Anyway, I'll shut up.
That's super interesting, Steve. Thank you. Just to come back on the history side of things, I think we've got this discourse that's anti-expertise now that's relatively recent, but I'm kind of quite interested in what happens after the Second World War. Rachel Bowlby's written a book on shopping, and she kind of argues that sales before the Second World War tended to be seen as quite a benign thing, a sort of individual interaction between two people in a shop that was very interpersonal and very kind of engaged and very much about understanding the needs of the customer. And that it moved, the discourse kind of moved to as kind of public relations and comms and advertising and sales techniques emerged and became a science of some kind, that suspicion of them really, really grew very, very quickly. And you ended up with these kind of paranoia almost about brainwashing and things. And I think you can kind of place Arnstein in that historical context, and it kind of sheds a rather different light on where it's coming from. It's quite interesting.
So the guide that Steve referred to is the guide to engagement that we have produced, and I mentioned briefly later on. But I think, Steve, in answer to your question of, well, yes, we haven't bottomed it out completely in that, and I think you're right. And it's been one of the things that's perhaps meant that we've kept on bouncing around between different versions. But I think it's something where the post-project publications will probably engage with this some more. Certainly Kira's doing some writing. Kira, Christine, me, overlap is probably going to be thinking about how does it, and probably Jill as well, how does engagement happen? How should we talk about engagement? So I think that we will aim to publish something addressing that issue, and perhaps you'd like to be part of that too. We can explore that. Okay, unless anyone has something they're desperate to say, I suggest we now have a break. So it's 11:07. Let's get back at 11:20. Anyone who's not already viewed the film about Bilton engagement in Bilton Primary School, Anne, could you put the link to the film in the chat? So it would be great if you could view the film, which is only 3 minutes during your break, while you're boiling the kettle or whatever. And I will see you back here at 11:20. Yeah, so just on the films, just for information, we have another film which is being made and we're going to get the draft by Friday. This is a draft film, so if you've got ideas about how it needs to change, let us know. Okay, see you later. Okay, so if people are actually back, could you put your cameras on so I know you're there? No cuts, Jill, I love it. Carefully positioned.
No more cuts.
Well, that was from a long time ago, but it still stands.
So, I mean, maybe we need to get started anyway. Having said, I would start at 20 past. So, so just a little bit of background to the films. I think we decided with the process of people leaving and coming back that we kind of wanted to find a way of evaluating that wasn't just us kind of doing research and filtering the evaluation through some sort of write-up. So we felt that it would be nice to ask a local film company to come and film while we were doing the engagements and while we were doing the construction, to kind of provide a more substantial kind of legacy and a appealing and aesthetically attractive legacy that would be more widely accessible than any sort of academic write-up from the project. And therefore we employed a local, a Hull-based film company called Nova Studios to come and film us, and they made 2 films for us. So the first one, which is the one you've seen via the link, is a film just focused on what happened at Bilton Primary School. The real reason for that was because, or the thing that drove that was we knew that the children would be doing this dramatic production, and we thought that ought to be filmed, and then it needed a bit of structure around it. Now, in fact, the dramatic production was more just movement rather than drama, and wasn't quite what we expected, but it's made a nice film, I think, anyway, and I'll ask you all for comments or thoughts on that in a second. In addition to that film, we've got another film which covers all of the sites and about sort of the Magic Project, what it sought to achieve and what it achieved, which we're expecting the draft of on Friday. Christine, do you want to add anything to what I've said about why we commission the films?
Well, only that what I mentioned before was that it would be something that would be then useful to the different buildings, the different sites, so especially the community-based sites, that they'll be able to use the film as a demonstration of what of their building, of what they do, of their activity, you know, and that they participated in a project with a university project that could go for them. The fact that it's ecological or environmental, that could go. We wanted to leave them something that could potentially be useful for them in terms of the promotion of their own activities.
Thank you. Okay, so I mean, we don't have to have comments on it, but if people have any comments, we'd love to hear them. Kate.
I thought it was brilliant. I hadn't seen that before. And for one question is, can we share it through the programme? Is that okay?
Not yet. We're just waiting for. When I interviewed Sarah, she was just double checking that all the kids in had clear, because it's children, so we have to be double sure.
And I mean, just another sort of observation, I just thought the way Dan described it was really nice. You know, it's just you get it straight away without any fancy language. So yeah, brilliant. I don't think I've got much more to say. I just thought it was very engaging. Yeah, really nice.
Thank you. Anyone else got anything to throw in on it? It's fine if we don't. Okay, so we will have another draft film. I think it's probably okay to share the draft film with the governance group, and ask for comments once we have it available. And I mean, unless we think there's something really wrong that we need a change immediately. But I think if we're relatively happy, we'll share it around and ask for more comments, because there might be little tweaks that you suggest that we wouldn't think of that can help us. So watch out for that coming on Friday or Monday.
Can I just say, I would prefer to share it with the sites first before we then share, just because we might think that it's fine. They might come up with something and say you just give them first first.
I suppose, but the governance group are not final users. They're more, I think both the sites and the governance group could give us comments that could help us make it better.
Yeah, it's just if somebody in the site say, I really don't want anyone to see me like that. It was just on that, just to check.
Right, so in a week or two then. Give them a deadline, Christine. So like, you must tell us by Friday if, yeah, okay, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on then to the other presentations, and we are doing well towards finishing early. So starting off with Isabel and Megan on the challenges of local resilience. So just to tell you what I gave them as their brief, I said, I know you've spent all the past 2 months desperately preparing this workshop you run on Friday, but give us some reflections on it.
Well, yeah, we definitely got some reflections on it. More so we're sort of in the thick of it in a way. It was only on Friday, so we're sort of still in that kind of analytical phase. So I'm aware that probably quite a lot of you were at the workshop, so it's going to be slightly repetitive. But for those of you not, then it should be fine, and I'm sure it'll be fine. Anyway, so we held a workshop on Friday. I think it's probably a good thing to talk about because it was kind of founded on a lot of the interviews that we've done. So I think the themes that come up through the workshop structure kind of are quite representative of some of the themes that have come up in the interviews that we've been looking at and grappling with. So the aim of the workshop was to explore routine, resilience and adaptation work, range of so community engagement.
Isabel, your sound went off in the middle of that, so it might be worth just turning your camera off.
Yeah, that's a good idea. My connection's not great. Okay, so is that any better? Can you hear me?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, that'd be better. The workshop was developed with and I, and we did thematic analysis of the different sorts of research data that we collected. Between us, we did interviews with whole residents, with community organisations, with industry and statutory professionals, participant observations of communities, and documentary analysis of different key policy documents that management and also resilience. And would it be all right to have the next slide?
Yep.
Thank you. So there were certain themes that came up right at the beginning when we were sort of devising, looking through the interviews. I've lost my connection.
Isabel, we can still hear you.
Can you still hear me? I can't see anything. Sorry. Well, that's okay. As long as you can still hear me, that's fine. I'll just carry on. The first theme, okay, you're vaguely back.
Meg, are you able to step in, or I expect Isabel will be back in a second.
Yeah, although I didn't know Isabel was presenting this because she just said I was going to sort it out. So I could.
Okay.
It might be worth waiting for Isabel to do it.
She's back, I think, yeah.
Am I back? I'm back.
You are back, yeah, we can hear you.
Chucked off the meeting now. Okay, so there was a tension that we described as square peg round hole, and this was between sort of new ways that we found people in sort of policy making as well as implementation were trying to work, but also trying to do, say, community engagement, but within existing systems. And certain tensions came up. So, for instance, we found there was a will to incorporate community engagement practices into current work, but this was in tension with kind of needing to produce quantifiable data that was, say, a requirement by funding, for instance. So a lot of the time there were sort of descriptions of community engagement sometimes described as sort of grey or kind of fluffy, I think were some of the words that were used. It was wasn't kind of, it was something that possibly that couldn't be grasped. There's a sense of that within the current system in which they were working. Another theme that came up was about policy time, was about time in general, about how we found that within policy, time seemed to be quite short and fast. And with community work and community engagement, there's this sense that that was longer and slower. And that created sort of tensions between obviously sort of producing evidence within certain deadlines and sort of the amount of time that could be spent and the kind of investment, I guess, placed in doing community engagements. There was sort of feedback in terms of, you know, sort of tendencies for community engagement to kind of like be kind of almost like helicoptering in a sense. And so these sorts of things kind of came up when we were thinking, looking at the interviews and thinking about the workshop. Okay, Anna, on to the next. Thank you. So the workshop, in essence, was really a continuation of our research practice as we continue to explore the themes with participants. We identified these themes in our analysis of the research materials and formulated areas and questions for further discussion within the workshop. So examples of this, and again, those in the workshop will be familiar with this, in interviews and policy documents, we identified a shift from infrastructure to people. So quotes like, we're moving away from infrastructure to people actions. In the past, we've always done flood defence to people. Now we're trying to move to a space where we do it with people. Or in the literature, policy documents, risk management authorities need to ensure that people and places are at the heart of local decision making. They also need to invest in engagement and take a more inclusive approach to flooding and coastal change. So these sorts of quotes from both interviews and also documents we presented to the participants and just asked them, well, what isn't working at the moment? Okay, Anne, so the next one. So other things we identified, we looked at policy documents, academic literature. We identified 3 approaches used to encourage and support people to try and adapt and become more resilient to flooding and climate change. And they were co-production, behaviour change, and place-based change. And we were really interested in, obviously there's the rhetoric of these sort of approaches and descriptions of them within literature. But we really wanted to understand how maybe this worked out in the practices and also the experiences of the workshop participants. So we asked the participants, what's your experience of these approaches? Do you agree with them? Do you agree with what it tries to do and how? Does it work? And if it doesn't, why not? And we were trying to encourage discussion between participants also surrounding these. Okay, Anne. I think throughout the workshop and also just through reading the interviews and sort of analysing them, there were certain overriding themes that we were continually conscious of. And these were themes of equity, of democratic participation, and the need for reflecting on and thinking about civic practice and also some kind of civic infrastructure. And there were certain words that we were continually discussing and kind of like grappling with in terms of we wanted to explore what a kind of a mutual and also equitable relationship between professionals and communities could look like. and especially with feedback from the interviews around how community engagement shouldn't be done to people. We really wanted to unpick who's the we. In interviews, we felt that communities were quite often at the sharp end of being positioned as responsible for resilience and adaptation interventions. This was also reflected in policy documents, and we wanted really greater reflections of the actions of professionals in their role in resilience and adaptation practices. And it was kind of opening up these sorts of discussions, opening up these themes, hopefully, that we tried to sort of look at the question of what do we need to do to collectively hold back the water. But obviously this is, we're still in this analytical stage, I suppose, and it was very much an opening up. I'm not sure, I guess maybe in a way I can hand it back to some of the participants maybe later on in the questions if you feel that there was any sort of conclusion sort of gained for you at the end of the workshop. But that's the work that we've been doing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. So we'll have space to discuss and reflect on that in a bit. Could we move on to Fran's presentation now?
Fran, I've shared. I would like you to share.
No, it's all right. I'll share myself because I make my presentations on Canvas, so I'd have to give you too many different permissions to do it. So I'll play it myself. But just to say, I'm sharing the results of a survey, which is not actually my survey. There used to be a staff member called Jo, who some of you might have met, and she created a survey, and it was going to be taken over by a new monitoring evaluation officer, but unfortunately we couldn't recruit. So we closed the survey about a week ago, and I just started looking at the results yesterday. So I'm just going to share some brief things from it with you. So I'll just share my. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
And you can hear me, okay, cool. So the survey was called People, Places and Rainwater. Some of you might have done it, hopefully. So I can't see you now, so if you have anything that I need to do so that you can see it better, just let me know. So I was just looking back at Jo's original documents to figure out what the purpose of the survey was. And she sort of identified 6 or 8 actually different, aims. So the first one was to gain insight into Hull and East Yorkshire, general public awareness and experience of small-scale community rainwater management. So awareness of small-scale SUDs. The second was to understand local public willingness to get involved in creating SUDs. The third was to identify public preferences for input from others, co-production, basically. The fourth, there we go. The fourth was to hear what benefits, if any, local rainwater installations could offer. Fifth was to understand if demographic factors influence people's interest in community SUDs, thus helping to identify target groups or challenges for future community involvement. The sixth was to illustrate any value of community engagement. So that would involve looking at what differences there were between people who had been involved in the activities that we'd done compared to people who haven't. The seventh was to provide some quantitative data to sit alongside any interviews and qualitative data that Magic will produce. And the eighth was to pilot a survey that could be expanded within or outside the area of Hull to compare different locations. So 135 responses were collected over 12 months. The communication channels were digital, mostly through local Facebook groups. So before I was a project manager, I was employed for 2 months for a few hours promoting this survey. So just joined loads of Facebook groups and promoted it through those. And then face-to-face at the celebration events we ran in Cottingham, Derringham and Chance Ave. We would have liked to get more responses, but unfortunately it just sort of because we didn't have a new monitoring and evaluation officer, it was less of a priority for the team members that were in the team. So I'm just going to go through 6 of the 8 areas, or maybe I'm going to go through 4, we'll see, that were identified as the reason the survey exists. So water butts, public awareness of water butts. You'll see that over half of the respondents actually do have water butts, which was quite interesting, and almost half knew that they could slow the flow of water to drains and manage flood risk. Green roofs, barely anyone has one, but around half of the respondents knew that they could slow the flow of water to drains and manage flood risk. Although 40% had heard of them but didn't know they could do those things, which is quite interesting. Trees, many people have a tree at home and many people know they can slow the flow. The results start to sort of flip when it comes to swales and other things. So 60% of people have never heard of a swale or seen them and didn't know what they could do, or didn't know they could slow the flow of water and manage flood risk. Similar results for rain gardens, never heard of them or seen them and didn't know they could slow the flow of water and manage flood risk. Rain garden planters and stormwater planters, similar results again. Permeable paving, about 23% of people have it, and almost half of the respondents knew that it could slow the flow of water to drains and manage flood risk. So willingness to get involved in creating SUDs. So designing, planning, are you thinking up ideas, drawing, choosing plants or materials? I mean, you can see here that most people probably or definitely would get involved in some way or another, but it increases the less involvement that has been asked of them. For example, the final one there is, I'd be happy to have one at my home. And that's where most people definitely would or probably would. So I'll just let you read that. And don't worry, I'll share these results as a report later on in before Christmas. So some common reasons why respondents probably or definitely would not get involved were time, which was the majority. Almost every comment mentioned time, mobility and age, skills and knowledge. Some people talked about not having the appropriate knowledge to be able to contribute, and cost, just 2 comments about cost. We asked about favourite types of SUDs, and everyone's favourite type of SUDs, well, not everybody, but the winner by far was water butts, followed by rain garden planters and followed by trees. And that's quite interesting because we obviously, as most of you will know, we focused on water butts and rain garden planters before we knew these results. So that's fortuitous. Preferences regarding input from others. So we asked about preferred input from different authorities such as water companies and local councils. And quite interestingly, most people want some sort of input. So only 14% of people said no input at all. Only 10% of people said I don't really trust the authorities or the ways they'd want to get involved. But 45 and almost 45 said they'd like help with ideas, such as being in touch with people who can offer guidance or some information, training and community events. And 38% of people would like a complete partnership where decisions and actions are carried out together. Only 15% of people trust the authorities to know how best to get involved. That's quite interesting. And those who said other ways, which was 10% of people, most of them mentioned funding, 1 maintenance, and the other 5 were quite miscellaneous comments. So we then asked about potential benefits, the wider benefits. So the question was, like to know what benefits and challenges, if any, you think you might experience from having these kinds of rainwater installations where you live or in your neighbourhood. Please rate how important these potential benefits might be to you. And to be honest, for both of them, most people felt that the wider benefits were all extremely important or very important. So more attractive space, more water available for gardening, food for wildlife, insects, and can't remember what that said, reduced flood risk, positive climate action. You can see it just with more and more people for each one. And similarly, most people were concerned or felt that these wider benefits, such as reduced anxiety about flooding, enhanced feelings of well-being, increased enjoyment of nature, increased physical health, I think that's through creating them, increased social relationships through maintaining them, I think that one said. Installations could enable volunteering opportunities and learning about water and the environment. You know, very high percentage of people thought they were all important. Extremely important, or very important, or at least moderately important. Potential challenges. That's a picture of Watch Park State. Features act as a focus for vandalism. So it's quite interesting actually, about 37% of people thought it was only slightly likely or not at all likely, but the majority did think it was either extremely, very, or moderately likely. Increase in mosquitoes and unwanted insects. See the results for this. Become an eyesore because of neglect. Too expensive to set up and maintain installations. An unwanted shift of responsibility onto the public. It's interesting, they're kind of similar results for every option. So finally, influence of demographic factors and the value of engagement activities. I have not had time to analyse that yet. Just quickly, 35% of the respondents had absolutely no experience at all in water management, or I think the question was in water management or nature. 60% of respondents were women, and they were not all old women. There was a pretty even distribution from about 25 years old to 75 years old. But I haven't had chance to look at how demographic factors influence people's responses, and also whether those who completed the surveys at the celebration events had different responses to those who completed it just completely, you know, without being involved online. So before Christmas, I'll put all that into a report and share it with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fran. Really interesting. And if you have some questions, write them down for yourself, or you could even put them in the chat so Fran can start preparing. And meanwhile, I will do the final presentation. Okay, can everyone see that okay? Need to tell me because I can't see you at the moment.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so basically I'm trying to do a little bit of a sort of summary and roundup in this presentation. It covers a sort of draws together some of what you've heard about, and mentions some other bits we haven't managed to talk about today, and sort of seeks to reflect on where they're going. So I'm going to establish the extent of our co-productive ambitions, to outline what we've done, and to identify some achievements and lessons learned. So I guess we kind of came and started with okay, you know, we want to address some of the managing stormwater challenges, with a recognition that there are some really water-related factors that are caused by the way we manage stormwater at the moment in terms of flood risk, pollution and drought. And where we were coming from was a kind of critique of the UK and indeed many other countries' approach to stormwater management, which we can see as modernist in terms of sort of built on an idea that the state or their agency should do everything and does not need the public, and reductionist in terms of thinking each part of the water system can be addressed and dealt with in isolation, and that that's the most sensible way to do things. And kind of in contrast to that, we wanted to aid the transition towards something which is increasingly being talked about, but is obviously, as Isabel's presentation has demonstrated, hard to achieve. So we wanted the research sought to aid the transition towards something that was more inclusive, in which the public have a role, and something which was more joined up, taking account of the different functions and indeed benefits of stormwater management. So our focus was on using action research, which was transforming via doing stuff and talking to people about doing that. So communicating by doing, trying to actually enhance local well-being in the Hull area, treating local people as experts, and creating a point for ongoing constructive conversations. So going back to those two things we were doing about joining up and inclusive, we were seeking to join up functions, so not just the stormwater management function, but also being attentive to ecological services and to the sort of cultural services for humans, contributing to health and well-being. We also wanted to sort of work across scales. In a sense, our work was very much at the local site scale, but we were talking about and thinking about and talking to our interviewees about things across more the city and the landscape. And we're conscious that there's a whole load of language that refers to things at different scales. In terms of being inclusive, our original project talked about working across all these different sectors of organisations, from local people through the community sector, through the formal governance organisations in the local area, with academics, but also across the nation with organisations overseeing adaptation infrastructure in the UK. And at the more local level, we were about co-producing change on the ground. At the more national level, I think it was more about co-producing knowledge and learning. We were also seeking to be inclusive via our participation strategies on the ground, which Christine's already talked about. So something which is actually perhaps more of an output than our starting point is that we've thought a lot about what would be inclusive language in this world. And as we know, there are a whole load of terms that are used in different countries with slightly different meanings. I mean, we've settled on, for our purposes, the term rain management or rainwater management because we think it's understandable to local people at a local scale, but it could perhaps also apply on a broader scale. I mean, I personally also quite like the term sponge cities because I think that is also quite understandable. And obviously, it's very explicitly bringing in that larger scale that perhaps for some people rain management wouldn't. Christine has already included this slide in terms of kind of what we're trying to do. So we're trying to engage, design and construct community rain management, and through that we hoped to both help communities learn and undertake this and then continue to do it in the future. You know, our original plans had lots of ideas about people having rain butts all over Hull. Haven't quite got that far. But we also wanted to learn with, well, really all of us learn together with community. So all of the academics and the authorities seeking to learn together about how do we work with communities on rain management? How does that process work effectively? And again, on the right side of the slide, the long-term impact of that might be a change in what the authorities do and a change in the rules, maybe, to support engagement with rain management. So what have we done? Obviously, as you know, we focused on Hull and East Riding, which we selected because it's an area where there was flood risk, significant flood risk investment, and some contrasting neighbourhoods, and also that the organisations were all working in partnership uniquely in the UK, which we felt was a really valuable thing to do. It was easier for us to interact with one set of partners rather than having different sets of partners sort of not working together. As you know, we did this building engagement in 5 sites across Hull. In addition to the sort of building engagement, which I think was kind of the call from which other bits emanated, as a set of other things we did. So I've talked already today about interviews with new housing developers. Isabel has talked about the interviews with local and national policymakers and indeed local people. Something which we haven't talked about today is a partnership with the Workers' Education Association to create a rainwater management course that was really pioneered and led by Time Bank, Hull and East Riding, and is certainly something that we may look to develop more in future. We have worked quite hard, and Kira in particular has been working really hard on this recently, in collaboratively developing a guide to engagement for SUDS and flood and water management practitioners. And as you know, we've done a survey of Hull residents to explore their knowledge of SUDS. So what have we achieved? I mean, I expect there's more that can be added to this slide. But I tried to take that sort of theory of change and say, okay, what have we done relating to the different bits of this? And yes, we did the building engagement. Through that, I think the public have learnt about rain management in 5 locations, and I suspect there is lots of ongoing learning, or will be once we get the signposts in. But we don't yet know exactly what was learnt. And I am very keen that we have a sort of follow-up project to do the evaluation that we'd had said we would do within the project, but just hasn't happened. We did a rainwater management course. It was great. Lots of people got quite enthused. We also had some reflections and learning about how it could be done better in future. There is a will to do it in future. And I think it's a question of us finding the funding to make that move forward. The other thing which we haven't talked very much about, but is another major achievement, I think, is that we've set up the Sustainable Co-op, which is established, and there is some continuing business for the co-op. So it is to be hoped that it will continue to build rain management infrastructure, small-scale rain management infrastructure in Hull and East Riding, or even possibly beyond. We've produced the engagement guide, which is not yet published, but very close to it. So in a sense, a legacy about how that engagement can happen, contributing to that learning together about how authorities can work with communities to achieve rain management. And in terms of actual evidence of impact, well, Rachel, I was very excited when you advertised your new 2-year role to work with communities in the council, because I kind of see that as a, I mean, you might well have done it anyway, but I think in the context of my institution, I can claim that it was an impact we had, that through demonstrating community engagement, Hull City Council has been prompted to create this new role. I mean, obviously it's 2 years, and that is because of your constraints, which I think is kind of part of my reflections about the challenges. Living with Water and Yorkshire Water, they do seem to be working quite hard to work with communities around their proposals. Again, they might have done it anyway, but I think I would claim that I might have been part of helping, or this project might have been part of helping to nudge that to be more interactive. As those who attended on Friday know, and some of those who saw all my rather frantic emails yesterday, out of the workshop on Friday, there was some opportunity, perhaps, we don't quite know, to influence the development of Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act, and we've sought to use whatever influence we have. So we can kind of see those as achievements. And as I say, there probably are more things on there that I've not yet included, but this was a sort of first round. Potential routes forward. In Hull and East Riding, we're looking at and talking to Rachel about a bid to scope out the feasibility of collating information from all residents about whether they own rain tanks, and with their permission then entering them onto a sort of communications database where we warn them rain's coming and ask them whether they would empty their rain tanks. It's a huge, ambitious project. I think we need a small project to scope out how it would work and to think about whether we really want to do, whether Hull City Council can really do it. But I do think that's a route for the future. On a much smaller scale, but also I think really important would be when we are waiting for the results of a bid to assess the impact of Magic Communications on adaptation signage and leaflets. We don't yet know whether it's been successful. If it's not been successful, there will be an opportunity to resubmit it. So I'm hopeful that we will get money to do that. What we have already know we've been successful on is a small bid to scope out a rain tank project in the Sheaf and Porter area, which would be really exciting in terms of transferring some of what we've learnt in Hull to our local area, making me feel more legitimate by working where I live rather than elsewhere. There's also a bid opportunity to make an animation about the multi-benefits of SUDS. I know that there are some really good animations that already exist, so I think we're going to kind of appraise what exists and think about whether we think there's something more needed or not. And there's a bid opportunity to work with the WEA to develop the rain management course. So altogether, those routes forward can be seen perhaps as rather more than one could, like all great opportunities, but I'm not sure we can do all of them at the same time. So I'm sure that funding and capacity will limit what we do. I'm just not quite sure in what direction yet. So just sort of stepping back to reflect a little bit more. The project was stimulated partly out of some really lovely work that a woman called Christine Wamsler did in Bavaria in 2000, well, she published in 2016. And in that work, she commented, targeted city-citizen, so city as in municipality, city-citizen collaboration for climate change adaptation is practically non-existent. So reflecting on where we've come in MOCA and Magic, we could say, well, it's not so common in Britain either, or, I mean, I think we need to sort of come down and define that. And I think there's a bit more of trying to work with citizens, but is it really collaborative? On most occasions, I think not. I think Magic has helped to reveal why. So focusing on the right-hand box, sorry, the left-hand box at the moment, I think it's shown that we should be having city-citizen collaborations because we know we need more rain management. We need it on public land. We need more spend to make it work, and we need people to be doing it on their private land. And you're not going to get any of that until you have more engagement. But in that context, why is there so little engagement? Well, partly because the benefits of rain management are dispersed amongst so many different agencies. So it's really hard for any single agency, for example, the local authority, to justify expenditure on community engagement. Certainly committing expenditure for the long term. I think another factor that contributes to it is something about evidential standards for public policy, that these tend to be based on a sort of atomistic approach to interventions. So this intervention's in place, now let's look at what impact it's had, on the sort of idea that the intervention is switched on and then it has an impact. And we know that communications and behaviour change, things don't really work like that. They work in a much more cumulative way where many communications can have an impact, but one communication by itself won't necessarily. And it makes it really hard to say, oh, this action is worth investing in because you can't prove that this action has made the difference. Don't know how to solve this, but I think it's an important point to keep making. So how on earth do we advance? Well, I mean, really, we advance wherever we're able to with whatever funding we can win, and I'm not sure we can steer it. In my fantasies, we might get money to fund a 10-year real-world experiment, working across agencies and topics to communicate collectively to everyone who owns rain tactics in an area about what they're doing and how they can help and how people helping each other, and evaluating that systematically. We just need to find somebody to fund that. So thank you for listening. Stop sharing. Okay, so I guess open for questions, clarifications on any of those three presentations. Ross.
Hi Liz, just a quick one to you, I think, do we have any resources or capacity to capture further impact? I.e., do we know if any other garages put in rainwater tanks or any individuals? Do we know any other spin-out businesses? How do we try and find a way to capture dissemination of some of the good ideas?
It's a good question. I mean, while we've still got people employed on the project, obviously there's some capacity to do that. So, I mean, we know that Souls was talking about putting in more rain management. I don't think they have yet. And clearly I've got ongoing, I can contact Rachel and others and ask them what's happened in the last 6 months or something, you know, in 6 months. Well, no doubt I'll be seeing her during a field trip. But apart from that, at present, we haven't got mechanisms to do that. Apart from a pending KE bid for Christine to do some post hoc evaluation of the communication stuff. I mean, I think if I can argue to my colleagues that this is a good impact case study to be, then funding could be one to do that. And I think I'm going to try and do that, but I haven't exactly worked out how to make that argument yet. Rachel.
It was answering Ross really. So yeah, I've had quite a few community groups that have come through to me and said they've seen what's been done on Champlands Ave, so they've been interested and they want to do that in their community centre and things. But unfortunately, I haven't had the resources to like actually do that. But Yorkshire Water have bulk bought a massive supply of water butts, and I think with the community cooperative sustainable that Dan's sort of running, the idea is that my new community coordinator, she's got a sort of little pot of money to actually be able to implement this, and that's quite a big part of her role will be to actually sort of go out and make this happen, and then keep that log of the ones that are put in, because we were using recycled IBCs, the great big like industrial storage things, and we put quite a few of those around the city, but this is sort of following on from that really. So we haven't got a way of doing it yet, but we are going to.
That's interesting, Rachel. Just to plug that, obviously we're after sort of, real money to follow up, but I guess urban planning and both us have master students that could maybe come next year or something to actually get data. That they'll come as a free resource, but we really would want to know where to prioritize and what sort of questions they could go out and ask.
I'm always up for some student participation. More than happy with that. Send them my way.
I have a question for Fran. Yes. So I thought it was really interesting. I'm really looking forward to the report, but just one background piece of information that I wasn't clear on. How many answers did we have, and how many questionnaires did we have answered? And what's your reflection on, I mean, obviously the people who answer a questionnaire are never typical, and particularly not the ways we contacted them in this context. So I suppose, I mean, we know that, but what can we say about the population of Hull and their position on these factors? bearing in mind the bias in the survey participants? I mean, you may not be able to answer that, but I suppose it's a question that we'll have to talk about in the report a bit.
Well, only 55, I think, of the surveys were actually completed at the engagement events, and the rest were completed online. And those ones, you know, I was posting in, like, you know, these like Facebook groups that it's Bricknell Avenue, Darrenham community, whatever. So it is kind of, you know, it's not necessarily people that are engaged with the project or engaged with this sort of thing. And 35% said, there was 135 responses, and 35% said they had absolutely no experience in anything related to water or nature at all. So I think, you know, more analysis of like the demographics is needed, but I don't think it's like only people that are engaged anyway, to be honest. I think it's quite a good distribution of age and gender and whatnot. I need to look at the postcodes better, but it was like a short form answer, so I need to like analyze that by putting it all together myself. Rich, I've just caught your question on the chat. Is that
the one in the chat? Yeah, that's why I just put my hand up. I was just really interested because I suppose it's that people just don't realise that they actually are responsible for that sort of rain that falls on the roof and how that then gets into the sewer. Only when it goes wrong, and then they have to get a plumber out, or, you know, get the great big whale machine to come and suck it all out. But which costs a lot of money and takes a lot of time. So it's that when we're asking them about SUDS, are they thinking that that's in addition to, or are they just thinking that that's us trying to put all the responsibility on them when currently it isn't? It's a really interesting one, isn't it?
The way that question was actually phrased was, if these ways of managing rainwater were created around your home, street, neighbourhood, or at local places you visit, would you want to get involved in any way? So it might be that, like, the no, I don't want to get involved at all people were thinking of, like, you know, community
centre. Yeah.
And it was interesting that a much higher percentage of people said they would do something if it was at their own home, compared to if it was like getting involved in designing like a neighbourhood SUDS project. So that's interesting. But no one commented on. Was there a question about whose responsibility it is? I don't think directly. Yeah.
I think we've asked that before. It's been one of our first questions, and interestingly, nobody says it's mine. It's all like, well, it's Yorkshire Water or the councils, and it's like, well, actually, it isn't until it gets to the street. So it's And I wonder if this is actually the crux of sometimes where we struggle, because there is that sort of lack of understanding of responsibilities.
Mm-hmm. And that's quite an interesting. I mean, I've had some discussions with Kira about whether we should create an animation to sort of show the potential deliveries, the multi-benefit delivery that SUDS can achieve. But obviously, that there's a really good animation that on SUDS that Syria already have, or I don't know where it came from, but Louise sent it to me. But I think, if we do think about it, Kira, I think that stuff about ownership and responsibility, I mean, not in a blaming way, but just that sort of recognition of some of those complex scale questions would be something that might be worth being aware of and thinking about. Christine?
And also how, like, I was thinking about that study we did in Leeds, where the culverts and things is actually, that whole responsibility thing changes. It's not like that's what water decides itself. I mean, water just kind of like swirls around everywhere. It doesn't understand the different borders. So just because it stops at the street, what constitutes a street, what constitutes where responsibility and ownership of water for where it is something that not only do we decide, but we keep deciding it differently. So it's not, I think it's important that kind of to understand that that's sometimes where the difficulties lie. Because where was that place? It was somewhere beginning with G.
West Gartha.
Yes.
And it was a culverted watercourse that was positioned between at the back of houses underground, and people bought houses and they didn't know they had a culverted watercourse there, and obviously they weren't going to take any responsibility for the culverted watercourse getting blocked, and we're like, why don't the authorities stop this all flooding upstream? But actually, you know, the legal responsibility is theirs, but not surprisingly
but it hadn't been when they were built. And it had changed, I think, from highways. I mean, the organisation.
It had always been theirs.
Oh, okay. What I understood from the discussions with the engineers at the time is the changing governance of water and land had altered over the years, so that there's kind of. I just think that's interesting for people to understand too, that it's not static, and that it's human decided. So I think it's a business of kind of like actually sharing the governance of our infrastructure with communities. And what we've got is a completely infantilized society at the moment, who just assume that one authority or another, and they're all interchangeable, will take care of it because that's what we've been told is going to happen.
Kate, you looked as if you want Kate Lonsdale. Do you want to say something?
Sorry, no, I'm just very interested in this conversation. I don't think I haven't formed a thought yet.
I mean, I know it's hard when because Isabel gave the first of these presentations. So, any reflections back to Isabel, or indeed, I mean, I suppose I want to say another big thank you to Isabel and Megan and Ruth for their input on Friday on a great day. And I thought it was a really interesting workshop. Kate.
Yeah, likewise, it was a really fantastic day. I really enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. I'm rather reluctant to go back to the definition of resilience and that concept, because you just get into a minefield. But I suppose I'm interested from the work that Isabel has done, you know, given that it is such a slippery and resilience, the term is, you know, it's in lots of policy documents, but it's often not really defined very well. And the difficulty comes, you know, the term itself is a decent term. It's, you know, can be used in a positive way, but the putting it into practice bit is where it all falls apart in my perspective. So I just was wondering if, Isabel, you got any reflections on, having done these interviews and this work, if you could go back to somebody writing policy about that, the use of the term, and how you support better application of the, any thoughts on that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's a slippery term. You're absolutely right. And I think we found that when we were speaking to people, very often they might have a definition that they could put into play, but it was almost, in some instances, it was a definition that was kind of it was circulating perhaps in where they were working, but it wasn't something maybe that was in practice or used. It felt like. But to some extent, it was operationalized in terms of, say, approaches. You might have, sort of certain policymakers sort of, focusing on, I think it's like property resilience and so on, in the way that they would interpret it as something to do with, kind of like physical infrastructure, sort of houses, property, but obviously community responsibility. And so it was quite varied and very slippery. In terms of, what did he say, sort of my recommendations for how it could be sort of used, or?
Yeah, just some any thoughts. I mean, partly, as we are the UK, well, I represent the UK Climate Resilience Programme, and the term resilience, I've always kind of, we're up against this conversation in a number of different projects, I guess, and we're trying to do this summary at the moment about the term. Well, I'm trying to sort of, I'm interested in that move from a kind of, a decent enough term to actually somebody trying to put it into practice, and the difficulties with that, and I think Jill's put in the chat something, you know, about
Yeah.
whose responsibility is this. Yeah. And neoliberal reflections, I guess, about what's it being forced onto communities.
Well, yeah, I think, you know, we explored as well in the workshop to kind of, there was a sort of tendency for, a general tendency for kind of resilience to be almost responsibility. And it was a little bit like, it reminded me very much of sort of the idea of like big society, you know, kind of stuff, the sort of, you know, the, and I think that's why, in a sense, that we took the approach in the workshop, you know, and it's also in lots of literature as well, in terms of, you know, thinking about who, you know, who else is involved in, you know, and you're talking about organisations, you're talking about policymakers, you're talking about a whole range of different people that are kind of missing, in a sense, if you interpret resilience in that way. But Megan, do you want to come in?
So yeah, I mean, I don't know whether it's, I mean, resilience is a slippery term. There's all of this stuff going on, but I think one of the issues is that it's just expected it will happen. Nobody really thinks about what the conditions of resilience, however you define it, to be successful or to actually play out in practice. And I think what's come up across quite a lot of the data that we've collected is that there is a kind of a reaction to this expectation that you will be resilient, born out of a lack of trust in various different systems. So I think it's not necessarily people don't like it because they don't know what it means. They don't like it because they don't know what it infers. And there's been some real breakdowns with particular institutions, which means that it can't kind of grow in a healthy way. So, you know, some people say, you know, oh, this is all about because people have a dependency culture on the local authorities. Well, you know, that's quite a problematic statement. And it's just like, well, and I think what we found is it's not necessarily that people have a dependency on the local authorities. Resisting resilience was an act of resistance, because it was just like, well, why the heck, you know, and not necessarily against local authorities, actually, because lots of people like local authorities. It's an act of resistance against the fact that why are local authorities and local areas being made to do all of this stuff if that person over there is not doing that. So it is about it being shady, but it's also about, it was almost like a form of quite unhelpful activism and resistance, actually, to kind of push back on this idea of resilience. So it wasn't about disengagement, weirdly, it was about the opposite.
So I guess a reflection I have as a result of Magic is it's all really hard. You know, that, you know, Magic tried so hard to do things in a co-productive way and to work really closely with people and to, you know, be attentive to their needs and so on. And we, you know, and there's a lot of resources in Magic. And okay, yeah, we did have the wild card of a pandemic and all the rest, but, you know, and we've done some stuff, but, you know, we could have done so much more if we hadn't done all that talking to people, arguably, whether that would be sensible or not, you know, but that, you know, it's sort of like from, you know, we've worked really hard. It's been really hard. Sometimes we haven't been successful. Sometimes, despite our efforts, people haven't been 100% happy. And yet, we've done so much more than local authorities or Environment Agency or any of the agencies could possibly justify. You know, that even if there was a government that was really sort of democratizing, focused on investing in community development, you know, that in a sense, my dream to support bottom-up resilience might be something like that. But even then, I suspect there's going to be continuous compromises and challenges and things where it's so hard to do it in ways that suit. I mean, basically, it's hard to do things in ways that suit everyone. And it's almost inevitable that one uses one's power. And, you know, I use my power as PI. Mrs. Defra, who was there on Friday, uses her power of Mrs. Defra, and you can make a difference if you write me a letter. So I guess, oh, not her, but somebody a letter. I guess that it just highlights how the challenge between aspiration and delivery, and how that's always going to be really hard to square. Christine.
Well, I think there's yes, it is hard. But I mean, I think community engagement is hard within the present climate because we don't have an infrastructure that supports it. It isn't a kind of, it isn't the usual thing to do. So you're always swimming against the tide, which is always hard work. I think it's also time scale. So it's really difficult to do anything and then show the evidence within the time span that you're given. So I love your idea of a 10-year kind of project, because I think then you start actually seeing the seeds that you sow, you see the justification. I also just think, we all have to look at, and you're talking in terms of means justifying ends. Well, the means here are the ends. The means is that people actually engaging with their own lives and their own environment and their own power. All of our power. We all have power in different means. I mean, really interesting what Megan was saying about actually non-cooperation as being a political act of resistance. It's kind of like, absolutely, when I talk to the kind of like, I don't know what they were, the apparently disengaged young people in Sheffield, when I did that study on the Manor, they weren't actually disengaged. They were very engaged in issues that concerned them. They were just not talking to the people who thought that they should be engaging with them. It's a difference. But what I'm trying to say is the means are the end. We're not doing something. We're not doing community engagement in order for there being an outcome. You do it because it is the outcome. That's me finished.
Well, that's why you do it, or maybe even why I and we do it, but it's not why everybody does it. Well, I mean, and you might think that's their problem.
It's some question their problem. I just think, I mean, in some respects, I see that as one of the reasons why we've got the environmental calamity that we have at the moment, is that we don't think in terms of processes, we think in terms of outputs and objects and ends. So I mean, yes, I'm unequivocally stating my opinion here. This isn't, I'm not, that is genuinely, that's what actually makes me get up out of bed and do the stuff that I do. So I'm just putting that out there.
Brilliant. Okay, so getting a slight feeling that we're beginning to come to an end and people's comments are beginning to finish, which is fine, because then half an hour early would be really good. But anyone, or perhaps we should just go around the room for final comments. Does that seem useful, or shall I just end it? What do people think? Or I'll give everybody a chance. Ros, anything you want to add? I'm going to go through my screen.
Yeah, no, I think it's really good. I'm quite keen to, I quite like the discussion Christine's having there, because I think there are deliverables as well. It isn't just the means. There are things too, and I think that is, maybe we have sort of a wash-up brainstorming session at some point, just to sort of clarify some of the processes and outcomes. I certainly like the idea of resilience, but I think the community can only do so much. So it's about partnership with other stakeholders. And I'm absolutely loved the presentation about the developers and how they think, because I think there's huge challenges there. Thanks,
Ros. Fran, anything to
add? Just two things. One, to highlight Kate from Time Bank's comment in the chat, which I haven't really mentioned within the team that much, don't know why, but Sustainable is doing extra work with a community named the Marthlake Centre with the Wildlife Trust on sustainable drainage, so that's really good. And the other thing I wanted to mention, which I've already talked to Liz about loads and Christine, was that one of the things that we were missing was expertise on the practical level. So we have the academic expertise, we have communities, but there's like a missing link there, which is practical suds designers who can actually, you know, design and install suds.
And you solved that through eventually. I mean, to some extent, Dan solved that, but Dan came in without necessarily having that expertise, but then got trained up by this woman called Wendy Allen, and that's been really
Syria.
Yeah, and Syria. Yeah, okay. Anne, anything you want to add? No. Isabel, anything you'd like to add?
Just that, well, I guess that we're just at this phase where we're sort of analysing a lot of the kind of what's come out of the workshop and sort of the interviews. So I'm hoping more discussions, even though obviously the project's coming to the end, will happen between us all. So yeah,
Isabel.
but it's been great.
Megan.
Yeah, I mean, I think like anyone who does a co-production project or anyone who has anything to do with behaviour change kind of has these conversations. And I'm just thinking like there's something going on here that is relevant across loads of different domains that we're all struggling with in terms of citizens, lack of civic infrastructure, lack of capacity, and thinking that, and lack of, and this complete inability to clock the fact that we're giving no time to something that takes a lot of time, and in a situation that has like been developing over the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution. And I just think there's really, really bizarre going on here. And I think this does say a lot about how we relate to our environment, and there's something fundamentally wrong. Like our environment is a different planet to us, which is quite bizarre. And I think that shows in all of these little things that we do, like behaviour change or community engagement with people who don't have any capacity, either emotional or financial. Yeah, and I think we need to do some like theoretical thinking here, and I think it'd be really helpful. And maybe that's something that Isabel and I can think about doing in these papers. But yeah, like it's really interesting. I feel like I could be talking to a group of public health practitioners who are trying to do stuff about diabetes. Like there's something going on here, which is common across lots of domains.
I mean, I think that's really valuable, because I think that people probably write about it in the environment area, they write about it in the diabetes area and so on, but bringing it together. Sorry, Christine, you're next.
Am I next to say something? I think I've said my bit. I think I said it loud and proud, really. Okay. That's me.
I'm Kira then.
Nothing to add.
Okay, Rachel?
But no, just really, yeah, what Megan just said, totally agree with that. It is across the board, I think, and it's just a shame that we can't convince maybe the government about, you know, instead of throwing money at capital, maybe it's actually time to park that thinking and think about revenue and getting more bums on seats to actually do some of this work. So it's just how we persuade them of that, isn't it?
Yeah. Jill?
Agree with Rachel and Megan, really, and I'd like to be in the conversations to think these things, these big thoughts, because I think we throw about these words like co-production and participation, empowerment and all those things, but you know, they're really complex. I think Magic's done an amazing job under difficult circumstances, and so there's lots to learn from it, I think, to take forward. But these things like resilience and co-production are very complex. I think it'd be great to have some discussions about it.
Kate McDonald.
Yeah, again, echoing systems thinking is really important here. And I think if we continue to keep doing these things in silos, then nothing's going to change. So I know it's like, what do we have the power to do locally? So how can we convene, in a sense, to think about, like, as Gerald would say, these wicked problems together? Is there an opportunity to do this? And I've always felt that Magic was a node of opportunity in the system to influence it. And I think just with all the challenges that have been talked about, there's some missed opportunities, but I feel fired up to like sort of harness that going forward. Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. And Kate Lonsdale.
Hi, yeah, I agree with a lot of that. So, I mean, from my position as sort of in the champion role of the program, there's 50 plus projects funded through the program, but I think Magic is really the one that's really tried to get to grips with this in much more detail, really, the real pragmatics of it. I know you, as you said, it was really hard. It is really hard, but I think, we all agree it's kind of really necessary. And so I'm just encouraging you to write those publications or sort of find ways to, it might not just be publications, other ways to sort of get this important message into people's minds, that we know that this is a gold mine. There's so much to offer here to other people, and it is transferable. It's not just necessarily rainwater management. It's much wider than that.
So can I just pin you down on that? This message, I mean, I know everyone's been saying different things and agreeing with each other, but what message? What do you see?
Okay, so there's, I mean, the terms that have just been, I mean, Kate's just brought in systems thinking. That was in addition to co-production, resilience. I mean, there's so much. There's like a number of different projects in the program that have looked at co-production, but some of it I just think is not very. It's sort of an interactive workshop. It's this project is thinking about co-production in a much more complicated way, and has a lot to offer, I think, to the messiness of it, but the point, I mean, going back to sort of the Einstein kind of ladder, it's sort of trying to, once you do get into the more sharing power, that's where it does become more complicated and more problematic, but that's where the real learning has to be. That it does take time. It's not simple, and it's about the academic also letting go of power. So I just think there's a lot that Magic, I would love to hear as someone sort of on the sidelines of it, but seeing what you're doing, that kind of gritty detail is the essential part that I think just other people, they talk about the word co-production, they talk about systems, they talk, but they don't really kind of, unless you've kind of got your hands dirty with it, you're not really, sort of, yeah. So anyway,
that's really useful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all for sticking with us through quite a long meeting, and through the project as well. I mean, there may be more opportunities, but I don't want to oblige people to attend more things, particularly, I'm particularly conscious of Rachel and Kate, coming in from a practitioner perspective. So really appreciate your input, and obviously hope to have more interactions with you in other projects in the future. So on that note, I think we should finish.
Thank you, Liz.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. See you all.